actually think it was still illegal to use and possess here when I was last here, so how the times have changed. Today I'm really excited to share with you the latest in anxiety, depression and PTSD treatment. There are two emerging medicines that are gaining momentum in the complementary therapy scene. And this is influencing institutions around the world to look at efficacy. These medicines are psilocybin for depression and anxiety and MDMA for trauma therapy. These medicines are being granted breakthrough therapy designations by the FDA in America. You may be wondering, why would I want to speak about medicines and therapies that are illegal to use and possess in Australia? The simple answer is because I'm more interested in what works than what is legal. In 2010, my former partner came home from service in Afghanistan with conversion disorder, a unique form of post-traumatic stress which causes neurological symptoms. The military's gold standard treatment of antipsychotics, antidepressants and benzodiazepines left him emotionally numb, dissociative and isolated. He soon turned to alcohol to feel something over the cocktail of prescribed pharmaceutical drugs. I was continuously dismissed by his psychiatrist when I expressed concern for my partner's well-being. So I began a journey to find him a safe, healthy and effective lifestyle protocol with modalities that typically weren't acknowledged by healthcare practitioners and in some cases weren't even legal in this country. And I wasn't looking for a one-size-fits-all approach. I was looking for ways to improve his overall health and lifestyle, and I was only interested in what worked. This led us on a fact-finding mission that took us to meet, interview, and learn from world-leading experts, professors, and doctors in mental health research. From Amsterdam in the Netherlands to California, Oregon, Arizona, Colorado, Texas, Ohio, Vermont, and Washington DC in the US, and then back to Australia and on to Canberra to advocate politically for medicinal cannabis legislation. This was the beginning of Weeded Warrior, Australia's only ex-service organisation advocating for veterans' access to medicinal cannabis. As a result of this work, in 2018, the Department of Veterans Affairs accepted medicinal cannabis as a treatment option. Now, this journey wasn't all just about my former partner. It would be remiss of me to not mention my own struggles with mental health and the experience I had with the standard pharmacological approach and talk-based therapy. My earliest memories of feeling anxious and depressed are from young as 5 years old. I was an extremely sensitive child, both emotionally and intuitively, and I mostly felt overwhelmed by other people's emotions. It was during my teenage years, which were full of angst, low self-esteem and low self-worth, that I was first prescribed an antidepressant. Not long after, I became suicidal. I couldn't get out of bed, I had no energy, I was highly emotional, I couldn't focus or concentrate, and I soon dropped out of high school. Needless to say, I didn't last on these drugs for long, but then I discovered that the effects of coming off these drugs was a nightmare in and of itself. So by the time I was in my late teens and early 20s, I'd modified my lifestyle enough to function, but I was by no means addressing the root cause of trauma. I didn't do that until many years later. In early 2018, I moved to Portland, Oregon, and it was there that I worked in the legal cannabis industry and was also introduced to a community advocating for and using psilocybin and MDMA for therapeutic purposes. And I'll share some of my experiences using them both soon. There are a few things I want to state very clearly before I continue. First of all, I'm not a healthcare practitioner and I'm unequivocally not giving health advice. I'm also not a practitioner in these modalities and I'm not advocating you to do these things or to break the law. And lastly, while I'm not here to criticise the government, the Therapeutic Goods Administration or Big Pharma, I know you're all independent, intelligent free thinkers and completely capable of making your own decisions about which political parties you align to. But I'm also sure that many of you want to see more drug law reform and more progressive, legitimately safe and effective mental health care treatment modalities. So in regards to the government and their medical institutions and chief health officers and their friends at the Therapeutic Goods Administration, I have witnessed firsthand from the front lines how slow, convoluted, and drawn out the federal legislation process was to overregulate medicinal cannabis in such a way that is difficult to navigate, expensive, exclusionary, and left to the discretion of mostly uninformed and naive doctors and dispensed by pharmacists who are mostly too inexperienced to do so. So personally, I have many concerns around the government's, the Office of Drug Control and the Therapeutic Goods Administration and their ability to regulate these medicines in a safe, timely and affordable manner. The purpose of this talk is to remove bias and taboo and to highlight where there may be ignorance and misinformation. This is a passion project for me because unlike many of the authorities and the so-called experts making decisions on these medicines, I have actually personally used these and gained enormous positive benefits in my life. My intention is not to point anyone in the direction of where to find these medicines or these practitioners. As an advocate, that's not my job. My intention is to help take this conversation out of the dark, shadowy corners and to shine a bright light on these life-changing and potentially life-saving medicines and therapies that can unfortunately continue to be demonized. We have experienced a global pandemic over the last few years that has saturated the media. But there is another pandemic that we have not been hearing so much about, and that is the pandemic of declining mental health. In the year following the COVID pandemic breakout, global sales of antidepressants rose a staggering 28%. That equates to an additional 43 million people using antidepressants in the US. The mainstream medical model for mental health treatment begins with pharmaceutical intervention like antidepressants alongside talk therapy, and as a last result, electroconvulsive therapy, because they're still doing that. These medicines are nothing more than a band-aid solution and develops dependency, which has kept people depressed, disempowered, and addicted. Over the last 50 years, psychiatry has had little impact treating anxiety, depression, and trauma. Their best efforts have resulted in big problems with addiction to Valium-like sedatives and unjustified overprescribing of antidepressants, and a flagrant disregard for therapeutic guidelines when it comes to antidepressant therapy. The global antidepressant market is worth $15 billion, and we are beginning to see a growing number of people discouraged by the efficacy of these pharmaceuticals and turning towards alternate and safer options. It is important to mention that despite what we've been led to believe, depression is not caused by a chemical imbalance or low serotonin. Instead, it is predominantly caused by a person's circumstances and life events and/or lifestyle factors such as poor diet, isolation, financial pressures, vitamin D depletion, work and relationship dissatisfaction, just to name a few. In long-term scientific studies, antidepressants have repeatedly been shown to worsen the course of mental illness. That's because antidepressants were never meant to be a long-term solution for mental health treatment. In fact, according to the pharmaceutical companies themselves, they are not to be prescribed for longer than 6 months and should only be given in conjunction with talk therapy. Antidepressants have a well-established history of causing akathisia-induced impulsivity and violent side effects, including suicide and homicide. The fact that many doctors fail to inform patients of the risks of akathisia, which is a severe agitation, liver damage, diabetes, dementia, bleeding, weight gain, sexual dysfunction, and reduced cognitive function, in my opinion, is not giving full informed consent. The myth of chemical imbalance gives many people permission to not look at the reasons underlying their depression and gives false hope for the safe resolution of mental health conditions. What's also overlooked by mainstream medical professionals is how extremely difficult it is to come off an antidepressant. Besides alcohol and opiates, they are known to be among the most difficult drugs to taper from. The average length of time withdrawal persisted for those who had been prescribed SSRIs was more than 90 weeks. That's almost 2 years. It is also well documented that tapering off an antidepressant, even safely and under the watchful eye of a healthcare professional, can cause antidepressant withdrawal syndrome, where adverse effects can include anxiety, mood swings, dizziness, digestive issues, pain, heart palpitations, insomnia, restless legs, and brain zaps, which, like I mentioned, can last anywhere from months through to years. Add to this an increased risk of suicide, and you're beginning to get the picture. While there may be some patients who don't experience coming off SSRIs, for others it can be a sign to restart their medication out of concern that their depression is coming back, or because the pain and discomfort is intolerable. While I admit more scientific research is needed, microdosing psilocybin could be a protection against this and may be a supportive tool to help the hundreds of thousands of people attempting to withdraw from SSRIs worldwide a safe, effective and natural way to do so. With Big Pharma making $15 billion a year, the question is, where is the incentive for them to look for safe, natural and patent-free treatment options for the masses? There are limited scientific studies on the effects of microdosing psilocybin, with researchers focusing their time, attention and funding on macrodosing. These studies are important and are showing great promise in treatment-resistant depression, particularly among terminally ill patients. Another really exciting and unsuspecting outcome is that it is showing that high-dose psilocybin can increase openness, one of the 5 dimensions of personality. That is, openness to new ideas, values, non-conformity, imagination, aesthetic appreciation, novelty seeking, and creativity. And in a mainstream society which is sadly embracing cancel culture and becoming less and less open to opposing ideas and opinions, in my belief, this is a very positive discovery. So if high-dose psilocybin can reduce treatment-resistant depression and potentially open a closed mind, what are the benefits of microdosing? The practice of microdosing involves ingesting a subhallucinogenic dose of psilocybin, usually about 1/10 of a typical tripping dose. And the most common ways to ingest it is in capsule form or as a tea. There are no classic psychedelic effects. Microdosing, by definition, is subsensory. If you take a microdose of psilocybin mushrooms and you feel an effect, that's not microdosing. The whole point of microdosing is to subtly improve your mood, energy levels and thought patterns just slightly above your baseline levels. You should still feel sociable and be able to complete all your normal day-to-day tasks. Microdosing has recently been growing in popularity, and the number of anecdotal reports from the underground community of citizen scientists and popular media accounts has been thriving, with some online microdosing communities having grown to the tens of thousands. This public interest speaks to a social need for scientific studies to inform the public about the effects of microdosing. Citizen scientists report many benefits from microdosing and relatively few risks. But don't take my word for it. According to a study by T. Anderson and colleagues from the University of Toronto in Canada, which asked a sample of 278 real-world microdoses on microdosing benefits and challenges, the benefits reported included improved mood, such as happiness, well-being, peacefulness, reductions in depression symptoms, improved outlook, appreciation of life, optimism, spiritual and emotional insights, and being more in touch with emotions. Reduced anxiety, including reduced social anxiety and sensitivity to trauma, improved motivation, confidence and self-care, improved sense of connection and empathy, improved creativity, such as shifting perspectives, curiosity and openness, improved focus, increased energy and cognitive benefits such as clarity of thought and memory, and physiological improvements such as enhanced senses, cardiovascular endurance, sleep quality, reduced migraines, and reduced substance dependence. Other perceived benefits of microdosing that were reported is the ability to control the dose. So unlike pharmaceutical interventions, where you can very easily and quickly become dependent upon them for years, if not decades, this emerging medicine empowers the individual to take control of their daily personal mental health requirements. Now, obviously, with benefits comes challenges. According to the same research in Canada, illegality was the biggest challenge, with concerns around the use of microdosing psilocybin considered illegal in most places, and the consequences of doing so can lead to arrests, criminal records, and possible jail time. This is certainly something to take very seriously here in Australia, where psilocybin is a Schedule 9 prohibited substance. Also of concern in this research is the availability and the cost of the medicine, as well as the social stigma surrounding the use of these underground medicines and feeling the need to hide one's activity from others. Also of interest with this research, and certainly from my own experience as well as mentors I've worked with overseas, physiological discomfort, increased anxiety and impaired focus were reported, but generally found to be associated with the dose being too high. And for those that are new to it, it may take a short period of time to find what is most suitable for you. This medicine, similarly to cannabis, is unique to you personally and requires experimentation to find your own individual dose. There has been limited anecdotal reporting on adverse events associated with microdosing psilocybin. And for those that are on antidepressants or SSRIs, the benefits may not knowingly be felt, but I've certainly seen it among my Portland community that it can be very helpful in supporting people in the process of reducing or tapering off psychotropic drugs. Again, I'm not advocating or endorsing the use of psilocybin, nor do I recommend coming off any antidepressant or SSRI without your support of your prescribing healthcare practitioner. How do you know if microdosing is working for you? You'll feel better or more content in some or many areas of your life. Some people report feeling happier, singing, dancing, and laughing more. Others report more positive thinking and less negative thoughts. But again, the changes will be really subtle, especially in the beginning. So journaling and checking in with your body by asking yourself how you're feeling and noticing the changes in your mood and energy is the best way to keep track of your results. Being patient with it is important. This is not a quick fix, nor is it the cure. When starting out, it is recommended taking CBD alongside your microdose. As we know, CBD is a proven anti-anxiety medicine, and the two work synergistically together. A simple Google search is all you need if looking for information, research, or protocols around microdosing psilocybin. Again, don't take my word for it. I recommend you do all your own research. This is how we begin to take responsibility for our own health and healing, and in turn, we can take our power back. While I was putting this talk together, a new study by Paul Stamets was released. Stamets and his team created an app called microdosed.me that allowed everyday people who were microdosing to document their experiences. There were 14,000 respondents, including microdoses and non-microdoses. And in a recent interview, Stamets opened up about this massive study, saying, "We were shocked. None of our researchers expected the data to be this good. We thought we'd see a little bit of an improvement, but not that high of an improvement over the baseline. We now know that psilocybin mushroom microdosing works. It is indisputable that there are benefits." My awareness around psilocybin began around 8 or 9 years ago, when I started with a couple of medium dose experiences at home, taken with therapeutic intention. Then I moved to Portland, Oregon, and was introduced to the benefits of microdosing. I can report that the benefits I experienced included improved mood, more energy, increased positive thoughts, better overall days, and a quieter internal critic in my mind. I wholeheartedly believe that microdosing helped ease my transition into my new American life, find my community, and reduce the homesickness. Again, this was in a state that had voted to decriminalise psilocybin, and it was fairly acknowledged and tolerated as an acceptable tool for mood enhancement, certainly among communities of psychonauts and citizen scientists. But it actually wasn't until the pandemic hit, and 2 weeks to slow the curve became 2 years of lockdowns and isolation, that I really started to use this natural medicinal fungi to its full potential. My US work visa was just about expired, and I was offered a job here in Australia to work in the pharmaceutical cannabis industry. Upon arriving back and starting that job, I soon realised that it wasn't for me and decided to go back to the US. On my way, I made a brief stop in New Zealand for a medicinal cannabis conference, when suddenly all the international borders closed. I had 24 hours to decide if I postponed my arrival in the US for 2 weeks, or to come back to Australia and wait for it all to pass. I considered my options and reluctantly chose to come back to Australia, where the healthcare is free and financial support available should I need it. I stayed with a friend in a remote rural area for the first 8 weeks. where I felt depressed, alone, and extremely isolated. I quickly realised I wasn't going back to America anytime soon, which was devastating and frustrating to acknowledge. I moved to the Gold Coast where I didn't know anyone, but I felt I had more options for finding work. However, given this new challenging and changing COVID world, finding work, especially with my previous work experience, was beginning to feel impossible. I struggled to meet new friends and build connections, and while I generally have a fairly positive, upbeat disposition, I just couldn't find a way out of my negative mindset. And depression was definitely starting to creep back in. I was frustrated, angry, and I was very much pissed off with the world, and it was written all over me. It was at this point I sourced a supply of mushrooms for myself by simply picking from a local paddock with permission, and I began taking small doses a couple of times a week, just like I did in Portland. I soon noticed many things in my life changed for the better. I found myself in a new community of like-minded people, exercising and eating better, making new connections, building a coaching business and supporting myself, studying, and while I wasn't even looking, meeting my new partner. And while I was still finding it difficult to live with tyranny, lockdowns, isolation, disconnection, masks and vaccine mandates, and the lack of legitimate science and open debate, I felt I was more connected to nature and to myself. I was noticeably happier, more content about where I was in life, and more confident about the choices I was making. I was doing what I loved, supported by like-minded friends and community, and had landed on my feet at last. And then I simply had no need to continue, so I stopped, and it was that easy. But don't get me wrong, these changes didn't come with microdosing alone. I had to do the work. I changed my routine, I increased my self-care, I took responsibility for my decisions and the parts of my life that weren't working. And it was in doing so that I saw the possibility in what my life could be. Now let me share about another wonderful modality that I've utilised in my healing. How many of you here are aware that you can use MDMA to treat trauma? Can I get a show of hands? Cool, awesome. Okay, so I'll take you back to 2014 when I was the co-founder and director of Weighted Warrior. I was connected with many US veteran organisations, and through them I've been hearing about research being conducted into MDMA by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And while I considered myself to be fairly open-minded, my considerable experience in drug use still had me somewhat sceptical. That was until I met Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, in 2016 that I really took an avid interest in it. My former partner and I had been invited to speak at a conference in Portland, Oregon about PTSD, flotation therapy and cannabis. Rick was also a speaker at the event. He came up to us backstage after we finished sharing our story. We all introduced ourselves, and he asked if we'd ever used MDMA before. Now, one thing I haven't shared with you yet. Prior to me learning about the benefits of cannabis in 2011, I was completely against drugs. Completely, I said no every time. Anyway, back to Rick. He asks, have you ever used MDMA before? I'm like, are you crazy? Never. Absolutely not, Rick. But I replaced my judgment with curiosity. After all, his passion and his research was very convincing, and he was impressed with our work and dedication to finding alternative methods. Rick was very encouraging of us to pursue this therapy when we returned to Australia. This was soon to be the catalyst I needed for my life to change, and I'll share a little more about my experience soon. Like I mentioned earlier, the epidemics of depression, anxiety, PTSD, addiction, and chronic pain are simply expressions of a psychiatric system that is largely devoid of effective and innovative methods to deal with the deeper issues underlying the symptoms. These underlying issues are poor emotional wounds, unmet needs of the psyche, isolation or disconnection from one another, and nervous systems stuck in fight or flight. Just to name a few, there are many more. Thanks to MAPS, we now have another tool that can greatly help alleviate so much suffering that our current system does not address. And in the specific case of post-traumatic stress, the data is irrefutable. MDMA therapy works. When it comes to treating chronic severe PTSD, the current model of psychotherapy and medication has a roughly 35% improvement rate. Now compare this to chronic severe PTSD treated with MDMA therapy that has a roughly 70% cure rate. Cure meaning the patient no longer even meets the criteria for a PTSD diagnosis. This is huge. Never before have we had such potential to help people heal trauma and instigate lasting change in their lives. There is a sense of urgency around widespread acceptance of this therapy. In Australia, we have now lost more veterans to suicide than we lost in the war in Vietnam. Now, it's easy to think that trauma is only associated with veterans of war, first responders, or rape victims. But I think it's important to point out that that's not the case at all. In the words of Gabor Mate, a world-renowned expert on trauma, addiction, and childhood development, trauma is not what happened to you, it's what's happening now inside of you because of what happened to you. It's a collective one that applies to all of us. Trauma is all around us and we're all affected directly or indirectly, whether it's through first-hand experience of it, witnessing it in a loved one, this is called secondary or vicarious trauma, birth trauma, childhood trauma, or even generational trauma passed down through families. Trauma is everywhere. And unfortunately, I'm not sure anyone gets a free pass. But trauma does not need to be a life sentence that you are stuck with. You may have heard the saying, hurt people hurt people. When we start to do our healing, we can end the cycle of trauma and it becomes unlikely to continue imprinting our trauma and hurts onto others. Now, you're probably not alone if you're sitting here wondering how an illegal party drug became a treatment for trauma. And it might surprise you to hear that it wasn't always considered illegal, and it was once upon a time used for exactly what I'm advocating for now. MDMA was discovered in 1912 by a chemist working for Merck, but no one really understood how it worked until a chemist named Alexander Shulgin independently synthesized it in 1965. Shulgin famously tested it on himself, saw that it had promise, and gave it to a psychotherapist friend named Leo Zeff. Zeff also thought it had great potential as an aid for psychotherapy because it lowered people's inhibitions and gave them deeper access to themselves. Zeff trained thousands of therapists around the world on how to use this compound in their therapy with great effect. But then it was caught up in the anti-drug campaigns of the 70s when the war on drugs began. Alongside cannabis and psilocybin, it was made a Schedule I drug in the US, which is equivalent to our Schedule IX, declaring it had no medicinal value and was as dangerous as heroin. And this is where it's remained ever since. But they got it horribly wrong. Whether through accident or intention, I'll leave that for you to decide. However, it's not lost on me that the drugs considered the most dangerous worldwide are psilocybin, MDMA, and cannabis. What we do know is that MDMA is one of the best compounds for dealing with trauma because it does three primary things. First, it relaxes the fear center. Second, it helps you achieve heightened sense of awareness. And third, it improves your level of connection between the memory center and the observation part of the brain. It bypasses our psychological defenses, therefore giving us access to the historical data needed for our healing. So how this actually looks is that it decreases self-limiting beliefs, increases self-love, heals unresolved, unreconciled, or incomplete psychological wounds or injuries, strengthens relationships through bonding, conflict resolution, and even assists conscious uncoupling. Which is actually where my journey with MDMA really began. Going back to 2016, after meeting Rick Doblin, my former partner and I came home from the US and took a very small amount of medicine. We had 2 sessions at home over a couple of months. And while it was incredibly bonding, we both had insights about how we saw our futures, and these futures didn't align. He wanted to move out of the city, away from as many people as possible, have a hobby farm, and raise children. I wanted to travel and experience the world, continue our advocacy work, and I wasn't ready to start a family. So after 8 incredibly loving years together, we came to a crossroads. It was such a difficult time. We had a couple of days away from each other to think about what we wanted. On the last day, he called to say he was coming home to chat, and I immediately knew it was going to be the end.
What's your name? Where are you from, man? You want an easier question?
I was so scared and filled with anxiety and grief. I started pacing the house. All of my trauma around my dad leaving when I was a little girl came rushing back, and my thoughts turned to, please don't leave me. I'll do whatever you want. We'll move to the country. We'll have babies. We'll live the quiet life. And even though I knew that I'd be miserable living that life, it was better than the thought of us going our separate ways and being alone. But then, out of nowhere, a little voice whispered to me to take a little dose of medicine. Now, a much younger version of myself would have said that I was just using drugs to cover up the discomfort of a difficult conversation and ultimate heartache. And I understand if some of you here think that too. But instead, it kept me strong. I didn't collapse or give in. I spoke my truth, and I stayed true to me. I listened intently to him. I didn't interrupt when it got difficult. I just listened, cried, and felt our deep collective heartbreak. This was the end, and somehow I knew we were both going to be okay. He went back to his mate's place, and I was left alone in the house. I was desperate to talk, so I got on the phone and spoke to anyone who would listen. It was during one of these conversations that I said I wanted to move to America. The problem was, I hadn't worked in 7.5 years. My skills were outdated, my areas of expertise meant little without a university degree, and I had no money of my own. I needed a job. But who was going to employ a 29-year-old with no skills? I soon learned that when you follow your intuition and make a well-needed change, everything falls into place. The next day I had a job. I literally called up a local float centre, and within minutes I was crying on the phone, asking for a job. Now, whether she felt pity for me, whatever, it doesn't matter. The very next day I came in for my first shift. I cried for the first hour, and then intermittently for the next 4 hours. I told her I wanted to move, she was so loving, patient and understanding, and I told her that I wanted to move to the US, and she said that I'd have a job at the centre until I made that happen. My now former partner and I were still sharing our home together, mostly quite well, but it was definitely a very difficult time as we both processed our heartbreak. I focused my spare time on finding work in America. The first person I contacted for a job agreed to hire me and support me in the grueling process of applying for a US work visa. 3 months to the day that my partner and I broke up, I was on a flight and I was moving to the US. Two nights before I left, we did our last home MDMA session together. We used this as an opportunity to deeply connect, share our favourite memories, tell each other how much we loved each other, reconcile our hurts, and say our farewells. Now, there are a few things I hope you hear and take away from this. First, MDMA is a major catalyst for change and healing unreconciled trauma. In this case, it helped me see past the story I created when I was a hurt little girl about my dad leaving, which presented 27 years later as me consistently putting other people's wants, needs, and desires ahead of my own. Secondly, that you can get your healing with this medicine without a psychologist or a psychiatrist. In this case, I sat alone for a bit, I listened to my thoughts, and I spoke to trusted friends who held space and just listened to me unpack what I needed to in the moment. I didn't need a psychiatrist who, in my experience, are there to listen briefly for specific symptoms that can fit very neatly into a DSM diagnosis, and then flick you a script for an antidepressant on your way out. And I also didn't need a psychologist who, in my experience, reinforce your sad story time and time again. There are even some schools of thought that say therapists will only get in the way of this work. Since then, thanks to being in America, I've actually had another 4 therapeutic sessions facilitated by a trained facilitator. Not a psychiatrist, psychologist, shaman, or healer. A trained facilitator who is safe, trusted, experienced with this medicine, and intentionally stayed out of the way so that I could heal myself. I empowered myself by becoming my own healer. I no longer outsourced my healing to others. It has been an intense process for me, but has taught me more about myself and allowed me to actually break the cycles of trauma more than any other therapy has done. And I have more than 15 years of talk therapy under my belt, which did nothing more than continue to perpetuate and reinforce my sad stories. So I think now is a good time to talk about safety, which policymakers continue to dispute. A supervised session is very safe, provided you have built solid rapport, discussed your intentions, and checked there are no contraindications. A facilitator is nothing more than a safe space holder and a witness to your healing. MDMA usually makes you feel like you drank a double espresso, your heart rate and blood pressure go up some, your body temperature slightly increases, you may get a light tremor, and you may even have some large somatic releases. And from there, it generally creates a feeling of love, well-being, and safety. Coming out from this experience, you're more compassionate, more empathetic, more generous, and kinder towards yourself and others. Statistically, a single therapeutic dose of MDMA is as safe as riding a horse or drinking a glass of wine. And it's certainly safer than riding a horse and drinking a glass of wine. But in all seriousness, there are still some medical and mental health contraindications, such as if someone has severe heart issues like very high uncontrolled blood pressure or advanced heart disease. There are rare issues with liver disease, making it challenging to metabolize the medicine. And if you're prone to chronic, severe, or poorly controlled seizures, MDMA could make it more likely to experience another episode. Lastly, the biggest potential for danger comes if you take MDMA when you're on antidepressants or monoamine oxidase inhibitors. If you take MDMA while on these drugs, it can cause some serious problems, including serotonin toxicity. While to some, it may appear that I am reckless, or a rebel, or a trailblazer, however you see me, I'm actually driven by research and science. And sure, we've all seen recently, science can be subjective, but I'm also driven by common sense. And common sense tells me we need to change the system immediately. It's thought, Einstein once said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We have been treating mental illness the same way for more than 50 years, and it has left us sad, depressed, judgmental, angry, suicidal, addicted, fat, disconnected, and disempowered. We've handed over our power, health, and happiness to those in white coats who claim to understand our own psyche better than we do. And we have been tricked into believing our unhappiness is not from our individual and collective trauma, but rather because we have a chemical imbalance. And that, luckily for us, Big Daddy Pharma swoops on in with a solution, a pill, with black box warnings of suicide and crippling depression. Einstein is also thought to have said, logic will take you from A to B, but imagination will take you anywhere. So let's imagine for a moment. What if we all had the opportunity to heal from our own trauma? What if we could put an end to our generational trauma? For that, I think we need a brand new culture. And one way we can create a new culture is to transform our language, especially around words like drug and medicine. Because it's clear nobody in charge knows what the heck they're talking about. Now, what sort of culture do we want to imagine? When it comes to treating our mental health, we want to imagine a culture where every compound is made available to us, no matter where it comes from, and especially when it comes from nature. And we don't want these decisions to be the domain of governments and corporations in their attempts to illegitimize nature. As we step out of the shadows of the last few years and into the emerging light, we must rely less on governments and demand more of ourselves. Finally, I've spoken a lot about my first partner here, my first love. There's one more thing I want to share. 3 weeks ago, my second love, my American partner, who I was with for almost 2 years, died suddenly and unexpectedly. We were still very close and we had a wonderful friendship. The pain of this loss, the grief, the anger, the confusion has absolutely brought me to my knees. I honestly believe if it weren't for this medicine work that I've done during my time in America to heal my trauma, I would not have been as strong, resilient, or resourced as I was to deal with this. In fact, I'd say I've never felt stronger or more proud of myself. When you do this sacred healing work, I believe it allows you to be so much more resilient in dealing with life's future curveballs. If there is one thing I wish for you to take away from today, it is that everyone deserves their healing with whatever modality they feel called to. Again, it's not up to governments, politicians, bureaucrats, or even law enforcement to stop anyone from getting their healing. Nor should they ever tell us how or what we can use to do so. It's time for us all to take a stand for our healing, health, and wellness. Because if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for everything. If you are looking for more information and education, there are some excellent documentaries, website resources, and books such as the How to Change Your Mind series on Netflix, which is also a book by Michael Pollan, a book by the name A Dose of Hope by Dr. Dan Engle, and of course MAPS is a wonderful online resource. Closer to home, I recommend getting in touch with and following the work of PRISM, the Australian Psychedelic Society, and Ethnogenesis Australis. These are the leading organisations in Australia for plant-based medicine, education, research, advocacy, and community. And if you wish to see legislation changed and access to plant medicines made legally available, I suggest, like I did with cannabis for many years, that you continue to write to your local, state, and federal MPs to express, or rather demand, more progressive drug law reform. Do I have time for questions? No? Sure, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I will just hang around, but I do just would really love for you to keep in mind that I'm just an advocate. I'm not here to help you, I'm not your hookup or to help you find any underground access. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was amazing. Thank you for sharing your stories with us. And can I just quickly slip this in and gift you a copy? If you want it signed, John's up at the Free Jewellery in the Sand. Now that was amazing. Thank you for sharing those stories. I'm sure many of you have got inspiration. So coming up next is Dr. Carolyn Bosak, who's going to talk about cannabis and sport. Do they combine or don't they? She's an integrative GP